The Snake That Eats the World attempts to explore the dialectics of structure and contingency, and spatialization and temporality. With structure and contingency, I'm particularly interested in how contingency might be ever incorporated into a piece. And for this, I turn to the distinction that Meazu draws between potentiality and virtuality in an attempt at self-criticism to say, is contingency currently being used to repurpose older notions of either indeterminacy or arbitrary spatialization, or worse, being a mere symbol or referent within the work's limits? How is it possible to overcome this false choice? So my first question to Jenni is, The Snake That Eats the World, through its notational conceits and its impossible demands, attempts to transcend this impasse. And is this ever possible?
So my answer to that is that given that most of the interpretive decisions are based on where the snake falls on the score, as a performer, you're not free. You have to sort of do what the snake tells you to. And that leads you to make some really unusual decisions and pushes you really to the limits. Within that, there is room for decisions at the sort of edges of those sections that can be more bodily led. Letting a gesture finish or cutting it short to jump to another gesture when it feels like the right thing to do in the body, like an instinctive kind of decision-making process or process of interpretation. So I think that the kind of balance between what the snake insists you do and what your body wants you to do creates a place of creativity and originality, and I think it is quite successful in that sense.
Cool. Well, that's wonderful. Let's attempt a further attempt at self-criticism. The second would be the second dialectic between spatialization and temporality, in that where you was one to notate the final performance, it would be a series of juxtaposed Stravinskian blocks. Does this then still represent something new, or an alternative, or does it just collapse back into one of these two false choices between spatialization and temporality?
I think not, because of the performer's agency in the piece, or the agency of the body of the performer, because you have an element of choice about what exactly you do, and you can allow your body to lead that. I think that prevents it becoming merely a series of juxtapositions. I think, for instance, there was a section where there was a lot of air sound notated in quite a driving, aggressive passage, and it just wasn't. It didn't sound right. It didn't feel right. It was awkward, not in a good way to do. So I experimented with changing it, and I changed it in the end to a series of tongue pizzicatos and normal notes, and that was, I felt, much more successful and got to the real heart of that passage quite successfully. So I think because of the performer's element of choice in that respect, I think that saves it from just becoming a juxtaposition.
Mm. Yeah, that element of, do you mind if I ask you a question just about the relationship between the choice affected by the notation of the snake, something that's within the limits of the work, for instance, and the second option, which is the ability to change anything. I draw this from the symbol that we've talked about before of the dice, the contingent, potentiality and virtuality. Indeterminacy is when you roll the dice. Contingency is when you attempt to force it to grow a seventh side. Can you speak about the relationship between those two choices with regards to that distinction?
I think that the seventh side of the dice is allowed or forced to be revealed by the extreme difficulty and complexity of the score, plus the visual aspect, which involves a lot of flitting between the different staves. And consequently, there's quite a lot of challenges in just reading it thrown up by that. But it forces you as the performer to make unusual and uninstinctive musical decisions, but always that's mediated by and balanced by knowing that you can also change things in the way that your body wants you to. And I think that allows you as a performer to transcend previous what like the work that you and I have done before. I feel that has allowed me in this piece to transcend what I've managed previously. On the other hand, the rhythmic challenges which are thrown up by the challenges of jumping from line to line, they disrupt the precision enormously and potentially cause a lot of trouble in being very exact. And that has been a bit of a battle for me, because I do like to do things very precisely usually, and approximation is not, I think that's not the route I want to go down with this sort of music. I think the solution for it is to do more. I think my toolbox, because this is quite a new way of approaching performance for me, I think my toolbox is a little bit lacking, and if I could do more of this sort of music in maybe a chamber music setting where I could work with others to improve the skill set needed, I think that would improve my ability to realize it in the way I really want to.
Wonderful, thank you. And can I ask one last question in terms of summing up about this contingent dialectic between the symbolic and the embodied, which I hadn't thought about really before this collaboration. I wonder if you could perhaps sum up how something like this score, something that is fundamentally anti-human, it's in every way conceivable anti-performance, and certainly anti the realism of performance that it should be. The performance is the key stage of the aesthetic object. This rejects that for the conception of the artwork as something that exists across time, across the process. But through that becomes certainly at that stage profoundly, and as I say, anti-human. In its prioritization of the symbolic to, what might almost be a comically ridiculous extent, the demand to have 3 mouths, 6 pairs of lungs, etc. And just to find your thoughts about that absolutism. Does this allow the body an absolutism in its own right? Is such a thing possible?
I think the anti-human aspect, as I've said, is sort of mediated by the fact that you allow for changes to be made. It's also pulling in the opposite direction is where the snake is, and needing always to try and conform to that. And that's the sort of the paradox of it. As I say, I think more experience of this would be useful in understanding more fully what's suggested by it. One thing I would say is I think that this approach forces the sort of poles of composer and performer to mesh and blur in this interesting middle ground in a way that I've not experienced before. And I think that's what sort of, even though it is profoundly anti-human, on one hand, it's all muddled up with an exceptionally human aspect, which is the performer, in a way that other pieces don't so much, because those two things are kept much more separate. And I feel like the process of interpreting this piece was extremely compositional. I don't even know if interpretation is actually the right word anymore. So yeah, I think that saves it from being completely horrifically impossible and anti-human.
No, that's interesting that you say it becomes enmeshed in a middle ground, and that, yeah, that is, I find that rather fascinating, in that the attempt to move through alienation, to use alienation as a form of collaboration, like the separation of composition and performance, to a point that becomes either humorous or cruel almost, actually brings you to this, to a point in which the performance and composition become totally separate.
Full circle,
yeah, that is cool.
It is.